Welcome in, everyone. You were listening to Bulls Central. I am joined with me today by a very special guest, a brand new guest to the show who I've been actually dying to have on the channel because he's such a well-known figure and voice to Bulls fans, and he's been kind enough to meet with me. He's had a very illustrious career in the field of broadcasting as a commentator for multiple sports, calling games from NFL, MLB, NBA, college football, college basketball. I'm sure there's probably others that I'm missing. He's worked at ESPN, more recently Fox Sports, and of course, you know him as the Chicago Bulls TV play-by-play broadcaster. Even if you're not a Bulls fan, I'm sure you probably have heard his voice calling some sporting event that you have watched. It is my pleasure to welcome to the show the one and only Adam Amin. Adam, it is great to have you on, and really appreciate you making the time, man.
Jamal, thanks for having me, brother. I appreciate it.
Now, Adam, we'll talk about the Bulls, this offseason, the upcoming season. But actually, where I wanted to start was talking about your broadcasting career. You've had a very successful career in the field and doing so at such a young age. How have you been able to navigate your career to where you are today? Because it's not like you're just the Bulls TBT play-by guy. Like I said, you're doing so many other things, whether it be with the NFL, the MLB. How have you been able to navigate through everything and managing so many different roles?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, it's not rocket science. Like we're fortunate, we're doing something fun and entertaining, and we take a lot of joy in that. So I try to keep that in mind. Like we're not saving anybody or anything like that. We're just trying to talk about sports, and we're fortunate to do it on a fairly high level. That being said, there's responsibility in it. Making sure that you're on top of all the information that you need to be on top of, and that you take the craft seriously so that you can deliver an entertaining call and an informative call, and something that, people at the very least, if they don't enjoy it, then they're not bothered by, for a few hours when they're watching on Sunday or watching a basketball or baseball game during the week or whatever it is. So just trying to be on top of like the time management aspect of it. Like right now is a lot of downtime. I'm trying to stay ahead of some things for the upcoming NFL season. I don't have a baseball game for a few weeks, but I don't, that's why I want to make sure that when I go back, I've been paying attention and I'm on top of, the main storylines, not just for the teams, but around the league. Especially, you get through the dog days of August, and, September comes in and football takes over, baseball takes a little bit of a backseat. So, you have to pay attention to it. So I think it's just trying to be on top of things, trying to enjoy it, trying to manage your time, and still be a student of it. And, hope that, that's how it comes off every time you go on the air.
Yeah, I mean, I have to always ask because I find it so incredibly challenging to even myself just keeping up with one sport. And I shouldn't even say one sport because I barely watch college basketball, but even just keeping up with everything going on in the NBA, knowing all the players, their backstories, trade rumors, everything that they're involved with, right? What are the strengths and their weaknesses? So for me, I can barely keep up with that. And, you're doing multiple sports, and it's not like you can just fake it till you make it, right? You can just act like you know what you're talking about. You're broadcasting the event. You kind of have to know what you're talking about when calling games. How have you been able to maintain the knowledge behind it all? I guess you said like it kind of requires a lot of research, general due diligence, but talk to me more about that.
It's definitely all those things, but I also think part of it is applying it for what I do for a living. Being able to apply it for your partner as well. Sure. I work with a lot of champions on TV. Like AJ Pierzynski is my main baseball partner. He's a World Series champ. Mark Schlereth is my football partner. He's won 3 Super Bowls. Stacy has won 3 NBA titles with the Bulls. So you defer. Part of it too is making sure that the people next to you are shining as well. It's in television. Kind of what we always learned was that TV is an analyst's medium. But the play-by-play announcer has to be ready for the big moments
Sure.
Because that you're kind of the soundtrack for the moment itself. But in terms of enjoying a game on television for over a long period of time, it's still an analyst medium, and you want to make sure that they're giving an audience something that's supplemental to what they're seeing. It's one thing to if you're a radio broadcaster, if you're Chuck Swirsky, he and Bill are creating a picture, but Chuck is doing most of the work. Like that's his job, is to create the picture of what's happening for a listener or for, somebody in their car or whatever it is. So for us, because you can see the picture, I want to make sure that Stacy or Mark or AJ or John Smoltz or Greg Olson or whoever I'm standing next to, has their chance to be able to explain the game from, the experts' eyes. They're the ones who played, they're the ones who've been through it. And, my job, as it was taught to me, and I do think it's the right way to approach it. If not it's certainly not the only job, but one of the main jobs of this position is to make sure that the people next to you are comfortable and given ample opportunity to be able to explain the game they're watching.
So I caught your guest appearance on the CHGO podcast, which was a great episode, by the way, for those watching. I'll leave a link
Dave
to it in the description.
Dave connected us, so I was happy about that.
Yeah, and Will Gottlieb asked you if there was a particular sport that you enjoyed calling the most, and I know you said you can't really answer that. It's more of a whatever the next big thing is, whatever's next on your docket, right, that you get amped up for. So I'm going to ask it a different way than Will did. But as you started becoming interested in this field of broadcasting, going to school for it, having dreams of one day being a broadcaster, was there a particular sport that you envision yourself wanting to cover? Because I can't imagine as a college kid, you were thinking, yeah, I want to do all of it, right? I want to do MLB, I want to do NFL, I want to do basketball. Maybe you were, I don't know. But was there a particular sport area of broadcasting that you really wanted to pursue more from the very beginning? And I promise I won't be offended if it's not basketball.
I think when I first started, I think it was probably baseball, because it was the first sport that I actually got to call on the air in college when I first started doing for radio. I had worked mock broadcasts and I had done a lot of studio work or as a freshman in college, which is typical for people at Valpo, where I went in Northwest Indiana. And once we got to baseball season, that's when the freshmen are allowed to kind of start stepping into the booth. So that was my first opportunity on air, on the radio, that people could potentially hear to do a game. And it was 9-0 Indiana State beat Valpo in Terre Haute. And the guy who originally brought me to Valpo or convinced me to come to Valpo, the guy from my hometown, was my partner, Ken Levitka, who is now working down in West Palm Beach, Florida, and has been the voice of FAU for a long time. And that was my first opportunity. And when I had the chance to finally work outside of the college bubble, I worked for a minor league baseball team in Gary, Indiana, the Gary South Shore Railcats, who are still, kicking around today. They're still doing their thing. So I think baseball was the first thing that I was introduced to that I was like, well, you're allowed to do this, so maybe that'll be, the sport that you end up chasing. And I did minor league baseball for, 4 total seasons. And I just kind of assumed that that's how it was going to be. I worked a small town radio station job for, I think, 7 months in Iowa. And I did a lot of basketball then. That's kind of what got me really comfortable with basketball after doing it in college. But we did everything, we did everything in the lead up to, getting into a real professional career. And I think that's served well to this day. That's just how I came up. That's, I think, how a lot of people my age who are in college, 10, 12 years ago, 15 years ago, which scares the hell out of me now to say that. But I think a lot of us were kind of raised that way, so to speak, by our circumstances. So there was a little bit of that, Jamal, like, you kind of are trained to do everything, but baseball was the sport that I was introduced to first outside of like a college scenario.
Is there ever a sport that you haven't done that you've kind of always been curious about doing? Because I feel like did I see that you did the hot dog contest one time?
Yeah, a couple of them. Yeah.
Is there like hockey or anything? Like, is there something you have not done that you've been curious about wanting to do potentially one day?
I'm not like excited to go out and do it. I'm intrigued by hockey. Like I
figured that was going to be one of them. Yeah.
It's such a unique skill set, the pacing of it and the incredible stuff like you hear just extemporaneously from some of the best hockey broadcasters. It's just impressive to me. I've done basketball on the radio. I've done NBA playoffs on the radio. When I was at ESPN, I did a lot of playoff games. And that was probably like the fastest pace thing, maybe college football on the radio in the modern era with the spread offense and the hurry up tempo. But those are the fastest things really I've ever done. And, like just hockey on TV alone, forget about doing the radio when you're really trying to add the descriptions to it. I think the hockey TV announcers are incredible. With just how they're able to command it. I mean, Pat Foley just retired and he was the first voice that I was imitating, like when I was a kid playing NHL 93 or whatever on Sega, you call the play-by-play and you did that for triple play baseball and for, NBA live and all that stuff. You just kind of did it.
Yeah.
You kids still do that. They do that naturally. It's kind of funny. Like they watch games and they just mimic it. And so every kid who watches sports at some point has probably tried to be a play-by-play announcer, even if they're, just watching a game with their family or something. So Pat Foley's voice was like one of the first I imitated. So hockey's always fascinated me. It just never really popped up, and it wasn't anything that I felt very comfortable with. So I didn't want to push my luck. I'll stick with stuff that I'm a little more familiar with and leave hockey up to the experts.
Maybe one day. You talked about, voices that you grew up with. It kind of leads into my next question. I want to talk about how you ended up becoming the Bulls play-by-play announcer, and then promise to those watching, we'll start talking about the team. But in the season before the pandemic, the 19-20 season, Bulls fans knew that Neil Funk was going to be retiring. That was going to be his last year. Unfortunately was cut short due to the pandemic. And I was dreading the day when Neil was no longer going to be calling games, because I'm such a nostalgic guy for the most part. I hate change, but we knew that it was coming, and unfairly so. I told some of my buddies during that last season, well, it doesn't matter who they replace him with. No one's going to be able to be as good as Neil. And like I said, it's so matter of factly, I was so biased because Neil Funk was my childhood. I grew up watching the 90s Bulls. I fell in love with the game of basketball because of Michael Jordan and that Bulls team. And because not every game was so readily available to watch like it is today on TV, I was that 90s kid who was listening to the radio, trying to get, the antenna just right to listen to Bulls games on the radio. And that was Neil. He was the voice of the Bulls to me. So, it stayed with me through adulthood, right? Because he then went on to actually do TV later on. So when it was announced that Adam Amin was going to be the new Bulls TV play-by-play broadcaster in 2020, I said, Adam Amin, is that the football guy, the college football guy? Because at the time I was actually really big into college football.
Sure.
What does this guy know about basketball, especially the Chicago Bulls? They clearly just hired this guy because he has that great broadcasting voice. Little did I know you're from Chicago, grew up a Bulls fan, and right away that first preseason game you called in 2020, instantly, I knew, okay, no, this guy's won me over. I take back everything I just said. But anyway, that was a long ramble. My question is, how did you fall into this job as the Bulls play-by-play guy? And was it a bit nerve-wracking for you knowing the shoes you had to fill for such an iconic voice and figure in the Bulls community in Neil Funk?
Yeah. Kevin Cross, I think, was the man responsible for it. One of the people. There are a lot of people responsible for making decisions like that. But I guess Kevin had seen my work. He basically runs NBC Sports Chicago.
Yeah.
And had seen my work in some capacity. I've never asked him about it, which, it'd be kind of weird to ask about it. But I guess he saw my work. I had representation, and at that point, I had been calling NBA games since the winter of 2016. In fact, my first NBA game I ever called was a Bulls Timberwolves game when Tom Thibodeau came back to the United Center, and it happened to be in Chicago. Like I have the photo of it up here. It's
no way.
Sitting next to Doris Burke, who was my partner that night, and we're both I'm laughing right before we went on air, and she's got like this smirk on her face. The photo really makes me happy because Doris is such a great person and a great partner. Yeah. But I got to do my first NBA game here, where I grew up going. I grew up going to the arena. I knew exactly where the garage was, I knew my way around, which was just so cool. So I'd been doing games, for a couple of years. ESPN had given me, as we talked about, playoff assignments on television and more so on radio. I'd called conference finals series. Steve Haddad at ESPN Radio took a huge chance on me and gave me an opportunity to cover this sport at like a higher level. And I loved it. So between that and Kevin Cross and kind of bringing me in, it was a really awesome, sequence of events that took place that allowed me to be just in the mix for all the, the fill-ins, sure. You remember that there were a bunch of fill-in play-by-play announcers, all of whom, have incredible talent. A lot of them are like, they significantly moved up. John Sadak's the voice of the Cincinnati Reds. Andy Demetro works down at Georgia Tech. He filled in for me this past year on one of the DeMar DeRozan buzzer beaters. Lisa Byington is calling the Bucks, one of the first female play-by-play announcers in NBA history. Kyle Draper moving on to Sacramento, and he's their number 2 play-by-play announcer there. A lot of people came in and had the chops. JB Long, does the Rams. Jason Benetti, obviously.
Jason Benetti.
So a lot of us could have filled in that that position. But I felt comfortable right away with Stacy. The first time I filled in, I felt comfortable with the crew. They made me feel very comfortable. And when I realized I first got the job, I to be honest, I cried. You know, it was my agent told me that they're making it official, and I lost it. It was a very emotional moment for me, and I'm an emotional person just in general, and it was a big deal. And with that comes that, you know, added pressure of just not wanting to screw it up, because like you, Jamal, it means a lot to me. I grew up with Neil.
Right.
I talked about this on air the night that he came back to be honored, and he called I think the second quarter of that game against Thunder. And the three of us, me, Neil, and Stacy, were all on the pregame show with David Kaplan together. And Cap asked me point blank, like, what does this mean to you with Neil saying, and I cried on air. And, you know, there's a lot of capital emotionally that's connected to me with this. So I was thrilled and emotional, but very, very nervous to step into a job like this.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's what makes you so good at this job, is the fact that you are an emotional Bulls fan. You know, it makes you, we relate to you, right? Because when you're screaming the DeMar DeRozan buzzer beater, that's me. You know what I mean? Like, unlike when you're watching a national broadcast, obviously it's exciting, but they don't have as much of a vested interest in the team. And it's also what makes JC great as well. I mean, and the chemistry that you guys have is really great. So it was not fair on my part to say that whoever they're going to replace Neil Fong with, they're not going to be as good.
Well, to be fair though, to your point, Jamal, so Joe Davis is one of my close friends in this business. He's the voice of the Dodgers. He and I are both on the Fox NFL and Major League Baseball rosters. I'm basically like right behind him. So he does the World Series. I get to do playoffs. Like, we're right. You know, we've known each other for years, and, you know, we're back to back on the depth chart, which is crazy that, you know, we both got to end up together in this capacity. But he gave me some advice when I got the Bulls job. You know, I'll use the word replace, and I'll tell you why I don't think that's a good word for it, but he replaced Vin Scully. This is great. You know, the late Vin Scully, we just lost him, arguably the greatest announcer ever. And in my opinion, certainly the best baseball announcer of all time. And, you know, he made it very clear, and this is how I approached it with Neil. He said, you're not replacing the person, you know, that was there before you. There is no replacing the person before you, because when you ingrain yourself to a community or to a team like that, there's no separating that person from the lore of the franchise. And Neil called 5 of the 6 titles, and he called Jordan's last shot as a Bull. And I love Bob Costas's call on NBC. I think it's wonderful. It really hits the moment. But Neil's call, hangs fire, scores, like, that's not going to go away. That will never go away. So, you know, the way Joe said it was right. You're not replacing them. You're just trying to do the job to the best of your ability. And that's all I ever want to do. I don't want to try to overstep anything. And I'm sure I have at some point in my career at various spots, you know, in various sports. But I think just trying to do the job justice and not feel like you're replacing somebody who's not going to be replaced anyway. You're succeeding them. You're just following them. And when you follow somebody and they leave a blueprint for you for how to do this job professionally and do it at a high level, like Neil's a great example and a great role model for something like that.
Yeah. So shifting gears a little bit, let's actually talk about the Bulls, because I know my audience wants to hear that, but selfishly, you know, when I have you guys on, I gotta ask all the questions that I've always been curious about. But we got the season starting in less than 2 months. Training camp, I believe, is less than a month away now. For the Bulls, somewhat of a quiet offseason. And I say quiet, relatively speaking, because we're comparing it to how aggressive the Bulls were last offseason and bringing in DeMar, Lonzo, Caruso. I know the offseason isn't over. Sure, the Bulls could still make some trades, but for the most part, it appears the roster is set. Were there any surprises that stood out to you and how the Bulls offseason transpired?
In all honesty, not really. Now, you could have made the point that you didn't expect Andre Drummond to get signed, or you didn't expect Dragic to get signed, but they filled gaps. They filled needs. They felt like they needed a physical backup center, and they needed what I kind of feel like is a really, really good insurance policy at point guard, especially considering the knee issues of Lonzo Ball, the injury history of Alex Caruso, the rigor that Ayo Dosunmu is going to go through in year number 2, even as a backup. You know, he only had to play essentially half the season in a major role, and he played very well in that. but I wasn't surprised with the approach. Both Arturas Karnisovas and Mark Eversley talked about continuity being a really, really important thing for this team, right? They really want to bring back the core of this group. And I've been saying that all off season, is that the core of this group, in my estimation, is good enough, or was good enough this past year, to have really been competitive in a second round series. For half the year, this was a first place team, really, before the injuries started to pile up. And, I think people realized how much of an impact Caruso has on a team, especially in the playoffs, how much of an impact Lonzo Ball had on this team because of what they look like offensively and defensively in the first half of the year. So the core itself is good enough to be a first round winner and be competitive with the teams that you might think are better than them in a second round series. Sure. Maybe with the right matchup, you win a second round series. I thought the core was there. So if it's Williams, Lavine, DeRozan, Vucevic, Ball, Caruso, you got Io, you got Coby White. Now you have a Goran Dragic and Andre Drummond as a backup center, Javonte Green and Derrick Jones Jr., guys who play very specific kind of roles and excel in them, like hustle guys. They really excel in those types of roles, run the floor type players. And you could also argue that maybe Dalen Terry was a little bit of a surprise with, I think a lot of us were like, well, EJ Liddell's on the board. That seems like a natural fit for what they need, like a swing guy or a 3-and-D guy maybe. But Dalen Terry, I think, could make an impact as a second unit runner, be a guy who plays good defense, plays good help side, and is athletic in the open floor and can handle the ball a little bit too. So I think they felt strongly about the continuity of the core and just wanted to get better on the margins. And while I agree it's not splashy, it may not be sexy, I think it's a really good plan to keep as much continuity in place as possible going into a year where, if you're healthy, you should be able to at least maybe not replicate, but see elements of what we saw in the first half last year. And hopefully that leads to success and wins and the like.
What are your expectations for the Bulls this upcoming season? I asked that because, last year was a little strange, right? In which they exceeded expectations initially to start the year. No one, not even Bulls fans, probably thought that they were going to be sitting with number 1 seed in February. And then obviously, the expectations grew much higher. Team didn't do so well. They underperformed to close out the year. Obviously, injuries played a part in that, but they fell below expectations. But in reality, they kind of then met those, right? As well as just based on the whole year, and people kind of predicted they were going to be a 44, 45 win team, and they were around that, right? As someone who's been following the team very closely, watching every possession, help us manage our expectations for the Bulls this upcoming season.
Well, I think the first thing to remember is the Eastern Conference is really good. And I don't think it got worse in this offseason. Philadelphia made some moves. Bringing in PJ Tucker is a big deal. Milwaukee re-signed a lot of this core group that made their finals run 2 seasons ago and won, and were really, really good all through last year for the most part. A very complete team that solidified itself. Miami has always been able to reload even when they've lost key role players. They still have Hero and Bam and Jimmy, and that's a pretty good trio to have as your kind of leaders. And their bench was really good last year. Yeah. They've had some finds. Gabe Vincent and Max Strus. They still have the presence of Udonis Haslem. That culture is there. The Heat culture that everybody always talks about. Boston's Boston. They're the reigning Eastern Conference champs. So the conference isn't getting any worse. It's going to be tough. And we're not even mentioning Brooklyn right now, and they're bringing back Durant. They're going to have Durant back. They just signed Marquise Morris, add a little toughness to their group. Yep. They had some depth, and Kyrie's going to play every game. So
at least we think so anyway.
We think so. Yeah. we assume so. So it's not going to be easier this year, but I think that's what having a veteran like a DeMar DeRozan, Vucevic, Drummond coming in, who's been a part of a lot of different styles of teams in his career, playing a similar role. I think there's an understanding of what it takes. You can't rest on your laurels here and just be happy that, we were a 1 seed for a good chunk of the year last year. That means, no, that doesn't necessarily mean that, but I think they have the right temperament in that locker room to kind of approach it the right way.
And so if you had to, give a prediction on where they would fall in the Eastern Conference standings, a way too early prediction, where do you think you put them?
Somewhere in the 4 or 5 range. Yeah. I'm not sure about Miami just yet, but I have confidence in Pat Riley to go make a move or to solidify his roster, or just guys play better. They typically guys do that with Miami. They seem to elevate their game, especially the younger, hungry guys. So, I think you can maybe put them right there with Miami, but Boston, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, there's just a lot of talent, and we're talking about some of the better players in the league. Now the Bulls have a great duo in Lavine and DeRozan. That's not changing anytime soon. But the same way you can't assume it with the superstars, or maybe you can. There's a reason you can kind of assume that's why they are superstars. You can assume that they can replicate a really high level of play. I'm scared to assume that for DeMar DeRozan this year. But every time you see DeMar work and you see how hard, how much work he puts into the offseason, how hard he goes at it. The guy was still playing in the Drew League playoffs,
games,
so, this guy's a basketball junkie. He puts in the work. So, maybe it's a little safer with him to assume that he can replicate his level of play from last year. The Bulls have the tools. I think that at the very least they have the tools. And it's a matter of execution on a night in, night out basis against some really talented teams and players.
Yeah. Speaking of talented teams, the NBA schedule was released. Actually, I guess that was a couple of weeks ago. When you see the schedule, when it's released and you go through the list of 82 games the Bulls are going to be playing, as a fan, you start picking out the ones that you say, oh yeah, this is going to be a really good one. You're calling the games. I know it might not be all of them, but you at least start calling the majority of them. Are there any that stood out to you in particular that you're really looking forward to being on the call for?
I mean, it's always the big guns. You're like, when you play Golden State? When do you play the Knicks? When do you play Milwaukee, which are key games? When are you going to play those teams that we just mentioned in the Eastern Conference? Phoenix on the other side, always a good barometer. The Lakers, because of LeBron, you're seeing the last couple of seasons. It feels like, he's made it very apparent that he wants that year in the league with both of his kids.
Yeah.
And, so if you kind of look ahead, there's 4 years, 5 years, something like that, whatever's left in the tank. So, you do have, when you recognize that that's on its way out, you want to appreciate that. So you'll always circle the Lakers. I think the Clippers got better. I'm fascinated to see the John Wall element of what they're going to do offensively and trying to run the floor. They've made it clear that that's what they want to do. Healthy Kawhi Leonard would be fat. He's one of my favorite players in the league to watch, just of how he's, DeMar and Kawhi just have very similar games on offense. And, there was that game a couple of years ago. I think the video popped up on my timeline a couple of weeks back about Kawhi just mid-range crushing the Bulls to death 2 seasons ago. This is before, obviously, the Bulls had DeMar. But, I mean, that he was playing like that. And I miss that caliber of player at both ends of the floor. So those are the types of games, you can name any good team pretty much. And that's why the games are fun. That's why the season's fun. Not every game is like that. Sometimes you play Sacramento or Detroit. And by the way, those are still teams that continuously play the Bulls tough and they still get better. And I can't remember. I think Sacramento may have beaten the Bulls this past year, and the Pistons made a game out of it against the Bulls a couple times. So you can't underestimate teams in this league. I think that's what those guys in the locker room need to know. And I think for the most part, they do know that.
I did want to actually talk a little bit about this past season because there were some incredible fun and exciting games to watch. And then some that weren't, obviously, but one that I think was probably the most unique was DeRozan's game winner on New Year's Eve against the Pacers. And I say unique, not just because there was a game winner, which doesn't happen often, but because of for us watching the game, we got thrown for a loop when suddenly Casey Johnson was on the call for the TV play-by-play, which bless KC, he did as well as anyone probably would, being thrown into that, very last minute. You ended up finishing the game and calling that incredible game winner that we all remember. Talk to me about what went down and leading up to tip-off. As I understand it, it was an inconclusive COVID test that you had, and how frantic was it among those in the media room to try to figure out who was going to be doing play-by-play? And in the meantime, what were you doing? Was it just sort of a temporary 1 hour quarantine while you were waiting to get tested? I've just always kind of been curious about what happened there.
Yeah, this was at a time, and obviously New Year's Eve, late December, where a lot of teams were dealing with COVID outbreaks, and this is why we had so many two-way players and 10-day contracts. Two-way players called up 10-day contracts being signed. More players than just about I can remember at any point in my life in the league, just because you needed bodies. So, we were in the midst of some more intensive testing, and we as the broadcasters were traveling at that point, and we were testing just about every day or every couple days. so we could travel with the team. And I showed, we take our tests about an hour or whatever it was. These are very impressively advanced tests, that we were given, and they do it in a pretty short amount of time.
Yeah.
20 minutes to 40 minutes, something like that. But when I got pulled off the air a couple of minutes before we were about to tip off, Mark Brady and Robbie Hummel and Tamara and Russ and our crew deserve so much credit, as does Casey, because Mark, who is our ace producer, and he kind of walked Casey through it. Casey, to his credit, said, "I'll do play-by-play." Like, he has never done play-by-play. And he was like, "I'll do it. I will step up when you need me." And that's the type of guy in person and teammate that Casey is too. Robbie was filling in for Stacy, who was dealing with COVID. Mm-hmm. Robbie goes with the flow as well as anybody, and sounds like he was ready for it the whole time. Yeah. They filled, I think something like 18 minutes of game action and got people through it. And Casey jokes around about it a lot. Like, I would have passed out if I had to make that call, which I thought was a funny line from his interview about it, but he handled it great. I mean, you can't ask anybody to handle it much better given the circumstances. So while I was in back, I was just retesting and then waiting, it was the sitting and waiting game. So these take 20 to 40 minutes, but that's a long time all of a sudden when you're just waiting for something to happen. And I'm also in contact with my Fox crew. I'm filling in on a higher crew that particular week. I think I'm filling in for Kevin Burkhardt. So I'm supposed to be in Baltimore on Saturday for a Sunday NFL game. And I'm texting my producer and my boss with Fox. And it's like, hey, just so you guys know,
I might have COVID.
I will let you know if anything changes. And I had to test negative twice to make sure that it was conclusive that I was negative. So the first test, wait, 20 to 40 minutes, it comes back negative. Okay, thank God. All right, let's wait. Another one comes in, wait 20 to 40 minutes, negative. All right, let's get back out there, and you do your best Willis Reed imitation and run out to the floor. I sit back down. I tell Brady, hey, I'm back, ready. Take your time. You let me know when you need me, and I'll jump in whenever you tell me it's clear. And they just took it to the basically 6-minute mark of the second, and Casey tossed it back to me when we came back from break, and was more than happy to give that up. But I thought he did a fantastic job in a really, really tough spot.
And it was a very fun and exciting ending too. I think you might have addressed on the CHGO pod, where does this rank among all the Bulls games that you called last season in terms of some of the best ones?
I mean, it's probably number one. It's just cool. You hope for buzzer beaters every night. It's thrilling. And that was my first one for the Bulls. The Damian Lillard got him at the United Center a couple of years back during the COVID season. And that's Dame. That's what he does. But DeRozan had done that once in his career before, and then did it on back-to-back nights. And the other, person that we mentioned, Andy Dimitra, because I got to call the New Year's Eve one, I had to go to Baltimore for my NFL game. So I couldn't do the Saturday game, and there was Andy stepping in, like, no big deal. Just stepped up, nailed the call, did a great job with that. He and I have known each other for a few years, and he's a great talent, and he filled in seamlessly. So, it was kind of disappointing. Obviously, you would love to have been part of the history of it, but I thought they did a great job with it too. So you just hope for that every night, and DeMar gave it to you on back-to-back nights. What an incredible feat. That just doesn't – those are special sequences that people will remember for a long, long time. That's the type of stuff that, goes down in your Hall of Fame plaque if you make it, or whatever your, basketball obituary is. That's going to be up there for DeMar.
Did you think the shot was going to go in when you saw him release it? I certainly did.
I didn't. I never assume. Here's the thing, from a broadcast perspective, you cannot assume. Sure. You cannot assume anything. And I also think that's true for when you say things like for the win. I'm very adamant. I try not to say for the win unless I know that there is not enough time for the opposition to get a shot off, or to even have an opportunity. So I wanted to make sure, but that's how tight DeMar had it to the wire, where I knew confident. I was like, no, this is for the win. If it goes, I think I said to win it or something, and he nailed it. So, but you never assume. You can't from a broadcast perspective, because then that's how calls get messed up. That's how you have to react organically. You cannot assume. So I didn't want to assume, but man, he kept it as tight as possible. And probability would tell you that that's probably not a typical 3-point shot that goes in, but that's just the zone that guy was in, man.
Also, not a shot that you would typically see from DeMar, and
A three-pointer of all things. Yeah.
likely knowing that there probably wasn't as much time on the shot on the clock that he thought there was going to be. But Adam, I'll get you out of here on this one. Growing up in Chicago, you grew up as a Bulls fan. You've been following the team for a while, obviously even more so the last couple of seasons with the role that you're in. Favorite Bulls moment as far back as you can remember? What is it?
I mean, I think it's unfair to say anything else other than Game 6 of '98. So I think because that's such an obvious answer. Yeah. I really do love the Steve Kerr shot. Partially because of the story behind it as well, you know, and the great lines he had. You know, that's Steve. He's just a funny, acerbic, you know, he's just a sharp guy. So it was a great delivery of that story at Grant Park when, you know, he was saying like, you know, Michael's like, I don't know how comfortable I am in these spots, and he was like, I guess I gotta
bail him out.
I gotta bail him out again, and that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. But my dad really liked Steve Kerr. He was a big Steve Kerr fan. Obviously, we were all Jordan and Pippen and Rodman fans, and you know, we have an affection for guys like Stacey on the first three-peat, and you know, Cliff Livingston and you know, Judd Bushler and Randy Brown. Like, we all have appreciation for them. But the Steve Kerr shot, because he was kind of a grinder, and I think people really got a sense for this in The Last Dance when they really locked in on Steve for a portion, which I'm so happy they did. Because his story is incredible, you know, going back with his father. And my dad just really liked the kind of grinder, overachiever. You know, he just described himself, Kerr did, as an overachiever. Like, he really just liked how scrappy he was, and he was such a talent. And to step up in a moment like that and to just make the shot, you know, I'm a smaller guy, you know, we're not tall people in my family. So, I always liked, you know, that the scrappy guy comes up big when, you know, the alphas needed him, you know, and like he really stepped up in a huge way. And I just like the story that's kind of attached to it. And that'll always be a shot that I'm very, very appreciative of as a Bulls fan.
I should have prefaced it because someone asked me once when I was on their show, you know, what's your favorite Bulls moment? I'm like, how can you not say Jordan's Game 6 game winner? So it's always good to have a backup. Steve Kerr is definitely, you know, that's got to be one of the best, and it's for the reasons that you just mentioned as far as the underdog story behind him, and then also I like the you know, Michael Jordan's whispering to him on the bench so that way the crew doesn't hear, and he's like, all right, if I'm open, I'll be ready. It's like hilarious.
No, man.
Adam, I cannot thank you enough for taking the time out of your day to meet with me, my man. Meeting with everyday Bulls fans, you know, I said this to both Stacey and Chuck when I had them on, but it really does say a lot about your character with you guys making the time to do this. So keep up the great work and everything that you do, and we're looking forward to hearing you call more games for the Bulls this upcoming season.
No, I really appreciate it, Jamal. Thanks for the time, bud.
Yeah.